By the time he was in his 30s, Thomas Edison had failed so many times that failure had almost stopped registering as an event. It just felt like weather. Something that happened around him, constantly, whether he paid attention to it or not. The rejections still stung, though. Not because any single one was devastating on its own, but because each one added another line to a story he'd been quietly writing about himself for years. Maybe this wasn't meant for him, maybe he'd waited too long, maybe other people simply had something he didn't. He could have walked away. Nobody would have blamed him. Years of trying, starting over, watching people with less obsession and less curiosity move further ahead, that's usually enough to make a person quit and call it wisdom. But he didn't know yet that the pile of failures around him wasn't the end of anything. It was raw material. It was slowly, invisibly building the person who'd eventually help change how the entire world worked after dark. As a kid, he'd been the type who couldn't leave a question alone. Adults would tell him, that's just how it works, and instead of accepting it, he'd go find out why. He took things apart. Edison resisted that slide, though not because he was unusually thick-skinned. Failure frustrated him plenty. Picture spending weeks, sometimes months, chasing something you were sure would work, only to watch it fall apart in front of you. There's no dramatic music playing when that happens. There's just a workbench covered in parts that don't function, a notebook full of ideas that didn't survive contact with reality, money already spent, and a long quiet stretch where you have to decide if the next attempt is even worth making. Most people chase success because of what it gives them once it arrives. Edison, for whatever reason, got obsessed with the problem itself. That's a small distinction, but it changes everything about how failure feels. If the reward is the only reason you're doing something, every setback is devastating, because it's just distance between you and the thing you wanted. But if you're actually trying to understand a problem, even a failed attempt hands you something useful, you walk away knowing more than you did an hour ago. That's the difference that kept him moving when other people would have stopped. He kept records of what didn't work. He changed one variable at a time and tested again. He built a small team around him specifically so failure wouldn't be a lonely, demoralizing event. It became something they worked through together, almost routine. Eventually, one particular problem swallowed a huge amount of his attention: light. Not light in general, artificial, electric light that was practical enough for regular people to actually use in their homes. The idea wasn't original to him, and it's worth saying that plainly, because history tends to flatten these stories into one genius invented it alone. Other inventors had already experimented with electric lighting before Edison ever touched the problem. What he was chasing wasn't the discovery that electric light was possible. It was something much harder: making it practical, reliable, safe, affordable enough that ordinary households could use it without rebuilding their entire lives around one fragile invention. Every piece of that puzzle could become its own dead end, and dead ends have a way of wearing a person down slowly, without them noticing until they're exhausted. Think about your own situation for a second. Maybe you've spent a year, or 5, trying to build something. Maybe you haven't even started yet, because you still remember exactly how badly the last attempt ended. You watch someone else succeed and assume they must have known something you didn't. What you don't see is the ugly middle they went through to get there, the stretch where nothing looks impressive, where a test fails and you adjust it slightly and test it again, over and over, with nobody watching and nobody applauding. Slowly, after enough failed approaches piled up, something started shifting. The problem that had looked nearly impossible began, bit by bit, giving up its secrets. The light got more practical. The system around it got more workable. And the years of failure started looking like something other than waste. They started looking like the path itself, just one nobody could see clearly from the inside. But proving a bulb could glow wasn't the finish line. That was almost the easy part, compared to what came next. Could it stay lit for a useful length of time? Could it be controlled, turned on, turned off, adjusted, without some elaborate ritual? Could several of them run at once without the whole system collapsing? Could an ordinary home or business actually use this thing without hiring a specialist just to keep it running? Answering those questions meant Edison wasn't building an invention anymore. He was building a system. And systems are where good ideas quietly go to die. Because you can have something brilliant sitting right there on a workbench and still accomplish almost nothing if nobody can afford it, maintain it, or figure out why they'd even want it. So the work expanded outward. He and his small team tested filament after filament, different materials, different shapes, different electrical arrangements, different ways of getting power from one place to another. Most of it failed. That's just what the record shows. Nobody handed him the answer early. He spent his time narrowing the field of what was possible, one failed test at a time. That's a completely different way to think about progress than most people use. The instinct, when something breaks, is to ask, why isn't this working? And that question, understandable as it is, tends to trap you inside the failure, replaying it, looking for someone or something to blame. There's a better question sitting right next to it. What did this attempt just teach me? One keeps you stuck. The other keeps you moving, even when moving doesn't feel like progress yet. It's not just useful for inventors either. It's useful for anyone trying to change their own life, which, let's be honest, is probably why you're still listening to this. Maybe you've tried to lose the weight and watched it come right back. Maybe you started a business that never turned a profit, or sent out dozens of applications and heard nothing back from any of them. Maybe you've attempted to write something, build something, learn something, so many times that you've quietly stopped trusting yourself to finish anything at all. It's easy to look at that pile of attempts as evidence stacked against you. But some of it might just be information you haven't studied yet. The business that failed might have taught you exactly what customers don't want. The applications that went nowhere might have shown you which skill was actually missing. The routine that fell apart the second life got hard might have taught you it only ever worked under perfect conditions, which, if you think about it, was the real flaw all along. Failure doesn't automatically make anyone wiser. You have to actually sit with it and study it, the way Edison did, over and over. He wasn't repeating the same experiment endlessly and calling that persistence. That's just stubbornness wearing persistence's clothes. He tested, watched what happened, adjusted, and tried again. Persistence says I'm going to keep moving toward this, even if I have to completely change how I get there. Stubbornness says I'm going to keep doing this exact same thing until it magically starts working. That distinction alone can save a person years of their life, because sometimes the dream isn't actually the problem. The method is. And admitting that takes more honesty than most people are willing to spend on themselves. For Edison, the breakthrough didn't arrive in one electric, cinematic instant. It came slowly, through a long grinding process of trial and error, until a carbonized filament design finally showed enough promise to justify pushing further. And even then, a new wall appeared almost immediately. Getting one bulb to work reliably wasn't the same as making electric light something an entire city could use. That meant power stations. Wiring running under streets. Meters. Switches. Safety problems nobody had solved before, because nobody had needed to. The idea had to survive leaving the laboratory and walking straight into the real world, which is a very different kind of pressure. Once an idea goes public, people get to have opinions about it. They criticize. They compare it to whatever they already trust. They point out, often gleefully, everything that could still go wrong. And with Edison's work, plenty of people did exactly that. There were skeptics. There were competing technologies already established and comfortable. There was no promise, and that the public would actually embrace what he was building instead of just tolerating the gaslighting they already knew. He kept working anyway. In 1879, he and his team demonstrated an incandescent lamp that burned far longer than earlier attempts had managed, a real, measurable step forward. But the bigger achievement came after that, not during it. Edison didn't stop at proving the bulb worked in a lab. He pushed to build an entire lighting system around it, and in 1882, his Pearl Street station in New York began actually supplying electricity to paying customers. Sit with what that really means for a second. The goal had traveled all the way from a flickering experiment on a workbench to something ordinary people could rely on in their homes. That's the real gap between having a good idea and actually changing the world with it, and almost nobody talks about how wide that gap is, or how long it takes to cross. This is where the story stops being comfortable, because most of us want the finished result without wanting any of the years that make a person capable of producing it. We want the thriving business, not the failed offers that came before it. The strong, capable body, not the humiliating first few workouts. The finished book, not the terrible first draft nobody was ever meant to read. We look at the finished product and quietly forget that someone had to live inside the unfinished, embarrassing version of it first, sometimes for a very long time. Edison lived inside that unfinished version for the better part of 2 decades. And even after the breakthrough, his story didn't suddenly turn perfect. He kept experimenting. He kept failing, sometimes badly. He made business mistakes that cost him. He worked on inventions that never became anything close to what he'd hoped. Success didn't remove failure from his life, it just changed his relationship to it. Before, failure had felt like a verdict on who he was. Afterward, it became simply part of the process, expected, almost boring in how routine it was. That shift is a skill. And it's one you can actually build, on purpose, starting with something small. Separate the event from the identity. You failed at something. That's an event, a specific thing that happened on a specific day. You are a failure. That's an identity, a story you've decided to wrap around yourself. Those aren't the same statement, even though they get treated like they are, all the time, by almost everyone. One of them can teach you something. The other one just keeps you locked in place. Then there is a second separation worth making, the goal versus the method. Maybe the goal you're chasing still matters completely. It's the way you've been pursuing it that's actually broken. Give yourself permission to throw out the method without throwing out the dream along with it. And once you've done that, make the next experiment smaller than you think it needs to be. Don't promise yourself you'll become an entirely different person by tomorrow morning. Test one specific thing. Give it a week. Watch what actually happens, not what you assumed would happen. Adjust whatever isn't working. Try again. None of that is glamorous. Neither, for what it's worth, was a workshop full of burnt-out filaments and failed wiring diagrams. The world remembers the light. Almost nobody remembers the hundreds of filaments that failed before the one that finally lasted. That's one of the strangest patterns in how we tell these stories. We remember the breakthrough and quietly erase everything that made it possible. But underneath every one of those tidy words, brilliant, determined, world-changing, is something much less exciting to say out loud. Hours. Repetition. Mistakes, corrected slowly. Patience that had no evidence yet that it was going to pay off. And the willingness to keep working through stretches where absolutely nobody was watching or applauding. That's where your own story is actually being written too, not in some future moment when people finally notice you, but right now, in the ordinary hours nobody sees at all. You may not be trying to change the world. Maybe you're just trying to get your evenings back, or finish something you started years ago and quietly abandoned, or become someone your future self could actually trust. It can feel small next to Edison's story. But don't underestimate what happens the day a person stops demanding proof, upfront, that the effort will be worth it before they're willing to give it. Edison couldn't see how far his work would eventually travel. He couldn't picture every home that would one day run on electric light, or how deeply it would reshape cities and factories and the basic rhythm of how people lived after dark. He could only work on the problem sitting directly in front of him. That's genuinely all anyone ever gets. One problem, one attempt, one small adjustment, and then another. Somewhere along that road, he crossed a line most people never even notice is there. He stopped needing every single attempt to succeed. He only needed each attempt to move him slightly closer than the last one had. That shift changes everything. thing about how a person carries their failures. If you need every day to be productive, one bad day can wreck your whole sense of momentum. If you need every project to work out, one rejection is enough to make you quit for good. If you need every workout to feel strong, one exhausting week sends you straight back to the couch. But if the actual goal is just to learn, adjust, and come back, failure stops holding the kind of power over you it used to. That's exactly what was happening underneath Edison's story, even when it didn't look like progress from the outside. The years didn't vanish. They became evidence that he could keep working through genuine uncertainty, evidence that one failed attempt didn't have to dictate what the next one looked like, evidence that a problem could seem impossible for a very long stretch and still eventually give way to enough patience and repetition. But the real test was still ahead of him, and it wasn't the one he expected. Once the world started paying attention to what he was building, everything about the pressure changed. Now there was something real to lose. The question wasn't whether he could keep experimenting quietly, in private, where nobody would notice if it fell apart. It was whether he could keep taking risks once everyone was watching the results. Success, it turns out, doesn't make a person immune to failure. If anything, it just gives failure a bigger audience. Once people are paying attention, a mistake stops being something contained inside a workshop. Investors can lose real money. Competitors get a chance to criticize. Newspapers start asking, out loud, whether the whole idea was ever practical to begin with. That kind of pressure changes people. It's exactly the kind of pressure that makes a lot of successful people quietly stop taking risks the moment they've built something worth protecting. They get careful. They stop experimenting. They spend their energy defending what already exists instead of chasing what could still be better. Edison kept experimenting anyway. That doesn't mean every decision from that point forward was the right one. It wasn't. There were disappointments. Business conflicts that got ugly. Inventions that never became what he'd hoped they would. His career was never some clean, uninterrupted run of genius, no matter how the story gets simplified in hindsight. But the habit stayed intact underneath all of it: keep testing, keep learning, keep moving forward even without a guarantee. And that might be the part of this story that actually matters most for you, sitting here right now. Maybe you've been waiting for the day you finally feel confident enough to commit fully to something. You picture waking up one morning and the fear just isn't there anymore. You'll finally believe in yourself. You'll finally know exactly what you're doing. You'll finally stop caring what anyone else thinks. And then, only then, you'll begin. That day might not come, not in the shape you're picturing it, anyway. The people who genuinely change their lives don't usually become fearless first. They become willing instead. Willing to be bad at something for a while. Willing to look inexperienced in front of people. Willing to start completely over when the first plan turns out wrong. Willing to put in months of work without any guarantee that anyone will ever notice. That's a far more useful kind of courage than the fearless version everyone imagines, mostly because it doesn't require you to feel powerful before you're allowed to start. So think about one specific thing you've been avoiding, not 10 things, just one. Maybe it's the business you keep saying you'll start. Maybe it's your health, which you've been quietly ignoring for longer than you'd like to admit. Maybe it's a skill you've wanted for years, or a project sitting untouched on your computer, or a job you know you should leave but haven't found the nerve to. Instead of asking yourself how to guarantee it'll work, which you can't, not ever, not really, try asking a smaller, more honest question: what can I actually test next? That question takes a huge amount of pressure off, because it doesn't ask you to build the entire future today. It just asks for the next experiment. If you're trying to write, that might mean one page. If you're trying to start something, it might mean one honest conversation with a potential customer. If you're trying to get healthier, it might mean nothing more than the walk you keep talking yourself out of. You might discover something along the way you don't particularly like. That's fine. That's not failure, that's information, and information is exactly how change actually begins. Not with certainty. With contact. You stop imagining the problem from a safe distance and start actually interacting with it, and once you're doing that, you can finally adjust. That's precisely what Edison did, over and over, for years. He never needed every attempt to prove he was brilliant. He just needed each one to tell him something he hadn't known an hour before. That mindset gives you permission to be a beginner again, which sounds small but genuinely isn't. A beginner doesn't have to know everything up front. A beginner is allowed to get things wrong. A beginner is allowed to change direction halfway through. Adults tend to forget this. We expect ourselves to be good immediately, and the moment we're not, we quit, without ever noticing that quitting at the first sign of being bad at something guarantees we'll stay bad at it forever. You have to survive the awkward stretch. That's where almost every meaningful skill actually gets built, whether it's inventing the light bulb or rebuilding a life that's gotten off track. Eventually, the world got to see the result of all that. Electric lighting stopped being a fragile laboratory experiment and became part of the infrastructure holding up modern life. The night no longer meant the same thing it had meant for every generation before it. Factories could run on different schedules. Businesses could stay open past dark. Entire cities began to change shape around what was suddenly possible. Homes lit up in ways that would have sounded like fiction only a few decades earlier. That's what changing history actually looks like, most of the time. It rarely happens in one dramatic second the way it gets told afterward. It happens when an idea survives enough failed attempts to finally become useful, and the person behind it usually has no idea, in the moment, that they're standing at the beginning of something enormous. They're just trying to solve the problem directly in front of them. That's worth remembering, because you don't know what your next attempt might lead to either. You don't know who might eventually need something you're capable of building. You don't know what skill you're quietly developing right now that becomes the foundation for something much bigger 5 years from now. You don't know which rejection is actually redirecting you towards something better, or which failure is just pointing at a weakness you finally need to fix. All you really know is what's sitting in front of you today. So work on that. Don't worry about becoming extraordinary overnight. Just become a little more honest, a little more patient, a little more willing to experiment, a little less afraid of looking like a beginner. And stop treating your past as some kind of guaranteed prediction of your future. Failing before doesn't mean you're destined to fail again. It just means you're carrying information you didn't have the first time around. Use it. Maybe you really have wasted time. Maybe you genuinely made mistakes you wish you could undo, or should have. These started years before you actually did. You don't need to lie to yourself about any of that to move forward. But you also don't have to spend the next 10 years quietly paying for the last 10. At some point, the only useful thing left to do with regret is turn it into a decision. Start. Try again. Change the method if the method's been the problem all along. Ask for help if you need it. Learn the skill properly. Make the call you've been avoiding. Take the walk. Write the page. Build the ugly, embarrassing first version of whatever it is. And when it doesn't work, because sometimes it won't, resist the urge to immediately decide you were never meant to do this. Look at what actually happened. Figure out why. Then make one more attempt. That's not blind optimism. That's simply how difficult things get solved, one honest attempt at a time. And if you've been stuck for years already, don't make the mistake of assuming your first day back has to look impressive to anyone, including yourself. It doesn't. Your first day might be 20 quiet minutes. Your first attempt might be genuinely bad. Your first month might produce almost nothing worth showing another person. Do it anyway, not because you're trying to prove your worth in a single afternoon, but because you're trying to become someone who doesn't abandon himself the moment things get difficult. That's a far bigger win than it sounds like from the outside. There may come a day when you look back at the exact thing that once embarrassed you and realize it taught you more than any of your successes ever did. You'll remember the rejection. The idea that went nowhere. The opportunity you missed. The project that quietly died. The months you spent wanting to quit entirely. And maybe, finally, you'll see something you couldn't see while you were still standing inside it. You weren't being prepared for some perfect, uninterrupted life. You were being taught how to keep going without any guarantees at all. That's a rare thing to actually learn. And once you have it, failure doesn't disappear from your life. It just quietly loses most of its power over you. You can fail at something without becoming a failure yourself. You can lose without deciding you're finished. You can start late and still arrive somewhere worth being. You can rebuild something you thought was gone for good. You can attempt something that genuinely scares you, and you can spend years convinced you missed your chance, only to discover the next chapter had simply been waiting for you the entire time. Edison didn't know, during all those early experiments, exactly what history would eventually remember about him. He was just solving the problem sitting in front of him, one attempt at a time. That's all he could actually do. And really, that's all any of us can do. So don't ask yourself whether you can guarantee success. You can't, and no one ever could. Ask yourself something smaller and more honest instead. Are you willing to make one more intelligent attempt? Then go make it. If it fails, keep the lesson and drop the shame. If it works, build on it steadily. If you lose momentum somewhere along the way, simply return. If you're rejected, adjust and try a different angle. If you're embarrassed, survive the embarrassment. It's rarely as permanent as it feels in the moment. Because your life doesn't actually change the day you finally become someone who never fails. It changes the day failure stops being the reason you stop trying at all. 20 years can look like an ending when you're standing at the far side of it, looking back. But while you're still here, still capable of learning something new, still capable of making one more decision, those years don't get to have the final word. You do. And maybe the most useful thing you can do today isn't some enormous promise about who you're going to become. Maybe it's much smaller than that. Choose one thing you've been avoiding. Give it a single honest hour. No perfect plan required. No audience watching. No announcement to anyone. Just you, the work in front of you, and enough willingness to finally find out what happens when you give it a real, honest attempt. Because you might be a lot closer than you think, not to becoming someone else entirely, but to finally becoming the version of yourself you've kept quietly postponing for years. And looking back on this ordinary day sometime down the road, you may realize it wasn't ordinary at all. It was the day you stopped asking whether you were capable of succeeding, and simply started finding out.